Welcome to my series of basketball videos where I'll be comparing various NBA grades against each other. I'm doing this because I find that a lot of the basketball videos comparing players on YouTube are too focused on the big names, and sometimes compare players from different positions. For example, lots of people compare Jordan to LeBron and Kobe to Duncan, just because of their similar levels of achievements, but since those players play different positions and have different styles of play, it's not an interesting comparison. In this series, I want to do a comparison not between just more well-known players, but players from days past, in the 1960s, 1970s, 1980s, and even the ABA as well, that most modern fans probably do not have too much knowledge about. Also, as much as possible, I want to compare players that play similar positions and have similar play styles. To me, that's a more interesting and fruitful comparison. I'll be using 6 different metrics to compare each player. The first category is scoring. This category will be defined by each player's career points per game, peak points per game both in the regular season and playoffs, and number of scoring titles. Rebounding. This category will be defined by each player's career rebounds per game, peak rebounds per game both in the regular season and playoffs, and number of rebounding titles. Passing. This category will be defined by each player's career assists per game, peak assists per game both regular season and playoffs, and number of assist titles. Efficiency and advanced metrics. This category will be defined by each player's career true shooting percentage per and win shares per 48, both in the regular season and playoffs. The reason I use true shooting percentage is because it's more fair to guards. Field goal percentage tends to be biased to big men because of their height and play style closer to the basket. I also put in win shares per 48 here because it encompasses efficiency along with other attributes to give you an idea of how many wins a player contributes to his team. Defense. This category will be defined by each player's all defensive selections, defensive win shares, and defensive player of the year awards. The reason I'm not using blocks and steals in this comparison is because I want to compare the achievements of older players that modern fans might not have too much knowledge about, and players in the 1960s and early 1970s do not have steals and blocks tracked. Awards. This category will be defined by All-Star appearances, All-NBA selections, MVPs, Finals MVPs, and championships as the first, second, or third best player. The reason I have to only count championships as a top 3 player on the team is because otherwise you get into the situation where, for example, Robert Horry has 7 rings and Karl Malone has 0. And it's not representative of how much better a player is if they weren't a top 3 player on their team contributed to a championship. I know including all-star selections is a little bit controversial because it's fan voted, but ultimately this is what the Hall of Fame uses in their criteria to induct a player, as unfair as it sounds. Also, I'll be including ABA stats and awards and using them as equivalent to their respective NBA stats and awards. The only one that's different about the ABA is that instead of Finals MVP, they have Playoffs MVP, which honestly is a better idea than Finals MVP since it accounts for the whole playoffs, but just to keep it simple, I'll be referring to the ABA Playoffs MVP as Finals MVP here. Also, no All-NBA third team selections are counted, because All-NBA third teams weren't added until the late 80s, which is unfair to older players. Also, I'm not using any career total stats because that's a longevity thing. For example, no one would say that Karl Malone was a better scorer than Michael Jordan, even though he has more total points. And of course, this is only going to be my opinion from comparing the available metrics, since I have not watched most of these players live, or even been born when some of these players have been playing. And to keep it fair, I'm judging them based on how they did in their own era. No time travel or what if this NBA player played in today's era or the 1960s, none of that. I'll be strictly basing their stats and accomplishments within their own era against that era's competition, which makes the most sense to me. So I hope you guys enjoy this comparison video and hopefully learn something new from it. The second episode in the series compares 2 1970 centers. Both won MVPs during the decade and both nicknamed Big Red. Dave Cowens was known as the engine of the 1970 Celtics, fulfilling a role as the second best player on the team and an all-time hustle player, while Bill Walton had a short injury-riddled career but is known as the main guy behind a championship Blazers team and a great six-man on a loaded Celtics squad. And both were good enough to win MVPs at a time when Kareem Abdul-Jabbar was winning them nearly every other year. So let's take a look at who had the better career between these two Hall of Fame centers. In the scoring category, it's fairly close, as both players were capable scorers in the mid-range and post. Cowens averaged 17.6 points per game for his career, peaking at 20.5 a game in 1973, and 18.9 points per game in the playoffs, peaking at 21.9 per game in 1973. Meanwhile, Walton averaged 13.3 points per game for his career, peaking at 18.9 per game in 1978, and 10.8 points per game in the playoffs, peaking at 18.2 a game in 1977. While we can clearly see that Cowens averages higher numbers across the board, in Walton's short prime he was just as capable as Cowens as a scorer, reflected in his peak averages. So in their primes it would be close, but overall I'm still giving this category to Dave Cowens. This category is also pretty close. Walton was a great rebounder, averaging 10.5 boards a game for his career, peaking at 14.4 a game in 1977, and averaging 9.1 rebounds a game in the playoffs, peaking at an outstanding 15.2 per game in 1977. You can clearly see that his career numbers are very different from his prime numbers, an indication of how much of a what-if his whole career is. At his prime, Walton was the top rebounder in his era, but Dave Cowens' rebounding numbers are not just top in his era, but some of the best rebounding numbers we've ever seen in NBA history. Cowens was a rebounding machine as he averaged 13.6 rebounds per game for his career, peaking at an incredible 16.2 per game in 1973, and an astounding 14.4 a game in the playoffs, peaking at 16.5 rebounds per game in 1975. Cowens was an all-time hustle player, and although Walton could match Cowens' rebounding numbers in his prime, Cowens still has the edge due to his consistency and even higher rebounding peak. Cowens often put up these rebounding numbers against much taller competition like Walton, along with Kareem Abdul-Jabbar and Bob Lanier. Charles Barkley, himself a great rebounder, was so in awe of Cowens' rebounding numbers that he often accused Cowens of stat padding. An interesting thing to note is that Walton has a rebounding title and Cowens does not, despite Cowens averaging higher rebounding numbers throughout his career, but this might be due to a timing thing, with Cowens' rebounding prime coinciding with Kareem and Wes Unseld's rebounding peak and Wilt Chamberlain's, the most dominant rebounder of all time, overlapping in his early career. So although Walton in his prime comes close, Cowens gets the win in this category. In the passing category, it's very close, as these two centers are two of the best passing big men of all time. Cowens averaged 3.8 assists per game for his career, peaking at 5 per game in 1977, and 3.7 assists per game in the playoffs, peaking at 4.6 a game in 1976. These are some of the best passing numbers we've seen from a center. Bill Walton averages 3.4 assists per game for his career, peaking at 4.8 per game in 1975, and 3 assists per game in the playoffs, peaking at an astonishing 5.5 assists per game in 1977. Although Cowens has higher numbers on average, Walton is known for his high passing IQ and also puts up some of the best passing numbers we've ever seen from a center as well during his peak. So since both players are so good at playmaking for their position, I'll have to call this category a tie. In the efficiency and advanced metrics category, Walton easily wins it, as he was much more efficient and in general took better shots than Cowens did. The true shooting percentage stats, PER, and win shares per 48 both back this up in favor of Walton, so this category easily goes to him. In the defense category, both players were great defenders. Cowens has 3 all-defensive selections, while Walton has 2. It's interesting to note that during Walton's short 2-year prime, he made the all-defensive first team every single year. Cowens has more defensive win shares, but that's only due to his overall longer career. The fact that Walton put up almost half the defensive win shares that Cowens had while only playing 3 healthy seasons in his whole career says a lot too. So Cowens had the longer career as a solid defender, while Walton was a dominant defender during his peak. Walton would probably win this category if his career was longer, but because of his short career it ends up being roughly equal. So I'll have to call this category a tie. In the awards category, both Walton and Cowens have their fair share of awards, with Cowens having 2 rings as a top 3 player on his team, 2-0 in the finals, as well as a league MVP. Walton also has 2 rings, one as the main guy and one as the 6th man, also has a league MVP and went to 3 NBA finals. Walton also has a finals MVP and almost made as many All-NBA teams despite his shortened career. To me, this is very, very close. Walton had one of the most impressive playoff runs in NBA history in 1977 with the Portland Trail Blazers, and defeated the favored Dr. J-led 76ers as an underdog, while Cowens has 2 championships as a main player on his team, although he didn't win any finals MVPs. Cowens has more All-Star appearances by far, but that's due to his longer career. To me, I feel aside from All-Star appearances, Walton achieved in just 3 healthy seasons roughly to what Cowens had achieved in his entire career. So I'll have to call this category a tie. So when all the categories are summed up, Dave Cowens takes 2 of them and Bill Walton takes 1, with the rest a tie, giving Cowens the win by a small margin. Both players were 2 of the greatest centers of the 1970s. Cowens was a ferocious hustle player who was a key part of the underrated 1970s Celtics and did a little bit of everything on the court. Most fans would probably consider Walton to have been the better player at his peak, but tragically had a shorter career due to injuries and is today known as one of the great what-ifs in NBA history. I hope you guys enjoyed this comparison. Thanks for watching. Be sure to like and subscribe, and stay tuned for the next comparison video.